So glad to be joined by Maven parent coach Melissa Benaroya. She is the mother of two and will be working, has been working with parents and children for over 20 years. She has helped over thousands of parents be more confident and connected to their children. And before we get into today's presentation, I want to let you all know that today's event will be recorded and all registrants will receive a link to the session in the email you use to register for the webinar. Throughout the session, please feel free to drop your questions in the QA bubble on the bottom of your screen as they come in. If you submitted a question at registration, we'll have those on hand as well. You will also have the option to post your questions anonymously, just so you know. We left a good amount of time at the end of our session for audience Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can.
Thank you so much, Diana. So wanted to start today with a poll, and I appreciate all of you that sent in questions, and I hope to answer those through this presentation, but I'd love to know kind of what is top of mind for you. So if we could launch that poll, that would be great. So where are your pain points? Give everybody a minute just to think it through, make their choices, and then magically see where you all are at today. So, do we have the results of the poll yet? Okay, adjusting to a bedtime routine, maintaining balance. It looks like we're pretty even across the board. So I'm going to address all of these things today, hopefully, and give you some tips, ideas, probably reinforce some of the things that you're already doing to make moving into this new school year as smooth as possible for you and set your child up for success. So the first question that came up quite often was about managing this transition from summer break back to a school routine. Transitions for kids are tough in the first place, any type of transition, right? It's from playing to eating. But going from a relaxed summer to a very structured school routine can be tricky. So one of the things I suggest to all of my Maven families is thinking about creating a routine chart. Kids thrive by knowing and understanding what is expected of them. And a routine or responsibility chart, whatever you want to call it, I try to avoid the word chore because it's kind of negative, allows you to create some structure. It's clear exactly what you expect of kids to do, and it allows for consistency, especially when kids would rather be doing other things than things like brushing their teeth or packing their backpack. Researchers found that the brains of humans have actually evolved to feel calm by repetitive behavior. So again, this allows things to move more smoothly because everybody's a little bit more calm. Using a routine chart also teaches responsibility, it encourages independence, and it allows you to avoid our struggles because many times we're the one directing the show, telling kids what to do, reminding them multiple times, nagging, and this can take you out of that dynamic. Now, one of the routine charts that I have found to be most effective are the ones that are created together with your child. So ideally, you sit down and talk about what are all the things that have to happen before we leave for school. And it's a brainstorming session, so there's no wrong answers. We just create that list, and then ideally we scale it back to 4 to 8 things that are non-negotiables that have to happen every morning, regardless of whatever is going on. And then the other kind of piece of this that's a little bit different is we're not going to buy a cutesy, there's so many adorable cute charts on Etsy and Amazon. The ones that I found to be most effective actually have pictures of your child doing the chore. So for example, I don't know if you can see this. This is a very old picture of my son making his bed in the morning. He's 3 years old here. He's 16 now, so doesn't look like that anymore. But seeing themselves, telling themselves what they need to do tends to be more effective than us telling kids what to do. And so what we're going to do right now, if somebody behind the scenes can drop in a link, I have a link to an article I've written on creating routine and responsibility charts, if that's of interest to you. And there's a download with some images of what it might look like and some guidelines as well. Number 2, this is a tough one, and I know somebody asked a few questions about bedtimes, but adjusting bedtimes and building healthy sleep habits. Healthy sleep habits are essential for kids to perform well in school. And ideally, and I know many of your kids probably have started school because it's different across the country, ideally, we start making a shift in that bedtime 1 to 2 weeks before school, because the reality is during the summer, kids tend to stay up later. Things are a bit more relaxed. The sun's out later. So getting kids ready to make that shift is easiest if we make small little shifts. Now, the reality is that sleep deprivation is real, and it's often the culprit of kids that are whiny, cranky, and uncooperative. So it's a win-win for all of us when kids get sleep. And the research has shown that sleep debt does exist, and that when kids miss as little as 20 minutes a night, 3 days in a row, it affects their cognition. So the ability to learn and process information. And they have found that when kids are sleep deprived, IQ levels can drop a grade or 2. So there's a significant impact on kids' performance. And we can't expect kids to perform well and function properly if they haven't got enough sleep. So keeping in mind, too, that weekends are equally important because sleep debt can rack up over the weekend. So trying to keep as much consistency in bedtimes on the weekend as there are during the weekday can be super helpful. All right, another hot topic with Maven families is building healthy screen habits. Another area where we tend to get a little bit more relaxed in the summer. And, you know, over and over again, I hear that power struggles tend to be a big issue, in addition to the concern about having too much screen time. The reality is that as a parent or caregiver, it is our responsibility to set limits. And every family is different. Our values, our schedules are different. So you have to decide what works best for you. Once you've created some clarity around what you think should be the limits, it can be helpful to talk to kids about why you're setting those limits, why you're limiting their exposure to social media. When they understand why, it's easier for them, and sometimes there's more motivation to adhere to those limits. Now, one of the ways that we avoid some of those power struggles is creating clear, shared agreements together. And those agreements include when kids can have access to screens, games, videos, the length of time, so limiting, you know, an hour a day or whatever. I'm not saying that that's what you should do, but just being really clear and specific. Also, where kids can use screens or devices. Is it important that they're in a community area so you can oversee what's going on? Or is it okay that they're in their room behind closed doors? So things to think about. One last thing is being really clear and specific with kids about what they can play or watch, because they tend to find things that we don't necessarily feel comfortable with. So defining that up front can help us avoid issues and power struggles. Now, the research has found that there is a link between social media and kids' mental health. So this is, some people are calling this a mental health crisis, because there is a correlation between screens, their use, and depression, anxiety, and the feelings of loneliness. So what we're going to do here in just a moment is I'm going to share with you another link. And this link is a basic article on setting limits. And there's also a download of an example device use contract. Now you can use it as a guideline, or you can print it out and fill in the blanks. But sometimes it's nice just to have that as a starting place. One thing lastly to keep in mind is that these are all big shifts for kids. So it's important to be flexible and patient as we go through these transitions. All right, let's move on to the next hot topic. And that is addressing kids feeling anxious about going back to school. So I want to share a few strategies with you so you are prepared if that arises for your child or your student. So number one, starting by just acknowledging and validating, letting child share how they're feeling and validating how that, understanding how that might feel. One thing we don't want to do is say things like, you're going to be fine, it's fine. When we do that, we tend to increase some of the anxiety, which typically has the opposite effect. So just repeating back what your child says to you, you can say things like, it sounds like you're worried about this, or, we can reinforce that I trust you're going to be fine. You're going to do great. I believe in you. So once again, reinforcing that you're there to support them and that they are capable. Number two, and this one we don't necessarily think about, but is super, super important, and that's regulating our own emotions. It's really important that we are a positive model for our kids, that we're enthusiastic about the school year, that we emphasize the opportunities for learning, growth, fun, new friendships, because when we show up that way, our kids are going to feel that way. So one thing, and I think this is the best kept parenting secret out there, one thing to know is that emotions are contagious and our brains are wired to emulate the emotions and behaviors of others. So we have these things in our brains called mirror neurons, and they're always firing off and they're influencing those around you. So you might notice when your child's feeling anxious, you too may be feeling anxious, but you have the ability to recognize this and self-regulate. And so by you focusing on calming your body, maybe by taking a cleansing breath or taking a pause, your calmness will influence them to be calm. So it's really important to be aware of how you're feeling, because we can't make our child feel less anxious. We can't make them calm down, but if we focus on ourselves, we can definitely influence them. So being mindful of how you're showing up and how you are feeling and managing some of those emotions. Number three, encouraging our kids to act brave. Even though kids may feel be scared, worried, anxious, they can still act brave in those moments. So, once again, reinforcing you can do it without, over reassuring them is perfect. Again, we're not going to say you're going to be fine. Feels very dismissive, but we can help them brainstorm and problem solve ways to manage those feelings. Or we can point to times where they've been successful in the past. So maybe saying something like, hey, you know what? When you started camp this summer, you didn't know any of the kids in your group. And, by the end of the first week, you had good buddies. What did you do? How did you make those friends? So we can point them towards times when they've actually been successful in managing similar situations. I also wanted to point to one resource that I think is really helpful if you do have a child that tends to be anxious. And her name is Karen Young from the blog Hey Sigmund. Her focus is all about child anxiety. She has tons of information. She has tools and books. So if that tends to be an issue, I think using her as a resource can be really helpful, in addition to obviously all of your Maven resources. Now, thinking about tools and strategies for managing these strong emotions, breathing exercises are extremely powerful. And so you may have heard of square breathing, where 3 or 4 counts, you breathe in, you hold 3 or 4 counts, you breathe out, hold 3 or 4 counts, you breathe in. So you keep completing the square of 3 or 4 counts several times. is one great practice to do with kids. Another is using imagery. So blowing out a birthday cake or blowing on some hot cocoa to cool it down, or a way that really young kids can get into breathing exercises. It's important that we practice this together because it's a skill and we need to teach it to our children. So that way, if they do experience anxiety and we're not available, they have a go-to strategy to help calm their bodies. Now, one of the, I think, most powerful ways to avoid anxious children is practicing without pressure. And that can start with starting your morning routine. So you may have a week before school starts where, you can get up early, have breakfast, get dressed in the manner that you would when school starts. Super helpful to start integrating. And that's why I suggest that routine chart, because that'll be the guide. But you can also do things like do the walk to school, or hop in the car and drive there, walk around the school, spend time on the playground. The more exposure kids have to that environment and that new routine, the more comfortable and reacclimated they're going to feel when it's time for school to start. So doing a dry run prepares kids and allows them to be less anxious. And part of that dry run too may be practicing a goodbye ritual. So how are you going to say goodbye at the drop off or in the car? Having that planned out can be a little bit easier because kids know what to expect. One of the, my favorite goodbyes is kids pushing parents or caregivers out the door because now they're telling you to leave. But it could be, 10 kisses, a hug. It could be, a high five, whatever it is. But having that ritualized can be helpful as well. Now, one thing I also want to note is that if anxiety is severe or persists, it may be necessary to seek some mental health professional to get some support. So maybe a therapist or a counselor. Maven has tons of therapists and counselors that you can consult with, but ideally you want to find somebody that specializes in child's anxiety. Children are unique, and so it's going to be a trial and error process. So it may take some time to find strategies that work best, and you can get support around these challenging times as well. So as a parent, your job is to be patient, supportive, and understanding as your child makes this big transition to school. All right, another big topic that tends to come up, and it not usually the first week of school, but it does tend to happen quite quickly as everybody gets situated, is having conflict with peers or having some social challenges with peers. And I think there's a lot that you can do to help your child, but also teach your child at the same time. And I like to use Dr. John Gottman's emotion coaching as a framework for helping children regulate conflict. So we're not going to resolve that conflict, but we can regulate conflict. We've got to be able to handle it because we're human beings. We're messy and we have conflict. So I just want to share with you a few elements of emotion coaching so you can maybe experiment with one of them. So the first one, which seems very basic, but is many times very difficult to do, is just simply listen. Let your child tell their story. Say things like, tell me what happened or what's going on, and then zip it. Don't interrupt, let them share until they're done. And then once they've shared, reflect back to them what you heard. Paraphrase what you heard them say so they feel heard and understood. Then we can move to emotions. Everybody thinks of emotion coaching, we go right to emotions, but we don't go right to emotions. We want to talk about kind of the facts and how our child is telling a story. Then we want to help them label their emotions. We don't want to tell children how they feel. So it can be as simple as like, how did you feel when that happened? With younger kids, it might be giving some choices about feelings. So they may not have a full vocabulary. Kids aren't just happy, sad, or mad. So it's building that vocabulary. So offering some choices. Were you frustrated or were you disappointed? Were you angry or were you sad? So we can give those options. And when they do share, again, we're going to acknowledge and validate that we understand how they're feeling and that it's actually natural and normal for them to feel that way. And then we can explore this situation together. And we explore by just asking some open-ended questions about those thoughts and feelings. But I think it can also be helpful to help children also consider some different perspectives of that situation that made them feel a certain way. So in every conflict, there are two things that exist. There are facts. The facts are what a video camera would have recorded. And then there's the stories that we create about the facts, because our brains are story-making machines. And many times, and almost every time, the opposite of our stories could be equally true. There may be many stories we can tell about the same set of facts. So helping your child see that there might be a different perspective on what's happening or happened can be really helpful in helping them regulate. And then lastly, we want to teach them some problem-solving skills. So we're going to start by just brainstorming some solutions together. Again, we want to help them and not take over. So we can say things like, well, what could you do differently? Or what would you have said in that situation, right? So we can prompt them that way. With younger kids, we might say, do you want to hear what other kids have done? Or do you want to hear what I did when I was a little girl and that happened to me? They love hearing it. So we're not telling them directly. We're kind of coaching them. We can also encourage them to think about times they've been successful. So remember last week when you were at the park, what did you do when the girl cut you off when you were trying to get on the swing? So we can help them use some of the skills they've used previously to manage a current conflict. And then we want to walk through some of those solutions. So ideally, we want to come up with 2 or 3 ideas. It doesn't have to be a long list. And then help kids connect the dots. Okay, if you tried solution 1, what would happen? What would your friends say? What would the group say? So helping them kind of think through what might be possible. And then after going through it and assessing pros and cons, letting them choose what it is they're going to try next time, or what they're going to try tomorrow, or maybe how they are going to repair a situation. So maybe our child is responsible for creating a conflict, and what they really need to do is repair in this situation. Reminder again, we are modeling everything for our kids, so we need to model in our daily lives healthy conflict resolution skills or conflict regulation skills in our own relationships. So not just using emotion coaching to help our children, but living it as well. And the more that we use a framework, the more kids are going to adopt and adapt to that framework and start to use it themselves. So the language that you use, they will start to do that when they're experiencing conflict on their own and they can manage it, which is the goal, right? We want our kids to be able to manage all of the challenges that face them, build grit, and be successful in navigating conflicts. All right, I think this might be our last big one for today, and want to talk a little bit about kind of balancing study time and school responsibilities and extracurricular. It is a balancing act, and I think equally important to getting homework done, which needs to be a clear shared agreement with kids. Extracurriculars are important because that helps build healthy children mentally and physically. Kids get to explore their interests and their talents, but equally important as these activities of homework and extracurriculars is actually making sure that we plan in some downtime, because our kids are stimulated all day long. And in order to have a healthy balance, we need to give them time to recharge their batteries. And in doing so, we also need to give them time to be outside, play, socialize in a very relaxed way. Socializing is a big one, especially after the pandemic, because kids have not been able to catch up with their social emotional development quite the way they might have if things had been business as usual. So being mindful that balancing all 3 of these is equally important. and is important for kids to have their own balance. Now, sometimes we can get overscheduled, and it's when we start feeling anxious or kids start resisting. It creates anxiety for kids. Kids feel pressure, and it actually hinders their ability to process and do well academically. So it definitely affects their academic performance. So being mindful of balancing, which leads me to the second one of prioritizing planning. So it can be helpful to sit down and write down all of the tasks and responsibilities that have to happen in the afternoon, because that's typically when kids have extracurriculars or have downtime. And assess if it's realistic. And if there are things, if your child has 4 extracurriculars and not sleeping well and not getting homework done, it might be time to reassess. Once you have that clear list of what works for everybody, it can be helpful to put it up on a whiteboard calendar. Having that visual will reinforce those activities that we've all agreed to, because sometimes kids resist doing the things that they've committed to, and sometimes that's homework. So having that visible on the whiteboard of school, homework, soccer practice, right? So having those things lined up and visible. When kids get older, it can be helpful to have like a shared Google Calendar as well, just to keep everybody organized and committed to doing the things that we all need to do. Now, naturally, kids are going to need a designated study space to get their homework done. So one other thing that we can do to encourage homework is set up a learning-free location for them. And it may be in your home, it may be at the public library, but making sure they have a place they can go to consistently that doesn't have distractions and is clutter-free. So also taking into account there aren't screens there like phones or apps popping up as well. So making sure that we turn those down or turn those off to make sure kids can really focus and get their work done. For some kids, though, they find it hard to concentrate. So we may need to break down their study time into 2 or 3 blocks. So just, you know your child best and what works for them. If they can sit down before dinner and bang through math and science, fantastic. If that's too much, then you may do math before dinner and science after dinner. So just making sure that we're setting it up for success. And in doing so, we can avoid lots of power struggles and negotiations that typically arise when we ask homework to get done. One other little strategy is also making sure that activities that are privileges, like watching a show or playing games, happen only after homework gets done. So having that as part of your clear shared agreement is equally important. And lastly, and I know this feels repetitive, but creating an after-school routine or using a routine chart can be really helpful, because in some families, and I know I've talked to a lot of Maven families about this recently, bedtime can be a challenge. So you can create a routine that starts from the minute kids get home from school all the way to lights out. Some families will create one from dinner time to bedtime, whatever works for you, but having that tool again will help everybody kind of move through the process with greater ease, because you're juggling a lot. You're juggling work, kids, household duties. We can use this as a tool just to help our kids manage themselves. So I just wanted to give you a few nuggets in each of these areas, because these were really popular questions. And in some cases, some of the things I may have shared reinforce things that you're already doing. So keep doing it. You might need to make little tweaks. But I want to make sure that you feel supported in your transition back to school, getting kids back in school, and that things go smoothly, so we can ensure your child has a successful start to their year. So I think I've probably given enough information at the starting place. Love to open up Q&A. So I think some of the questions we got, I tried to answer in the presentation, but if there are some other questions, would love to answer those. Diana, how much time do we have for Q&A, just so we know?
We have about 10 more minutes or so. So we'll jump into the Q&A section. Thank you, Melissa, for sharing all these really helpful tips. They were great. So with the remaining time, we'll take some of the questions that our participants have shared. Our first one being how to manage the daily morning protests of, I don't want to go to school.
Yeah, that is a tough one. Well, I think when we set things up ahead of time and do some of those practices, it can prepare. We don't want to wait till the last second. So one thing that I have found to be really helpful in inviting kids' cooperation is when we move through the morning routines, that we offer some limited choices. So it might be, hey, sweetie, it's time to get dressed for school. Do you want to pick out your clothes or do you want me to pick out your clothes? Do you want to wear pants or do you want to wear a dress? So giving kids some control many times can invite their cooperation to do some of the things that we need for them to do, which they might not always like, which is okay because our job isn't to make our kids happy all the time. But they will feel more cooperative and do the things we need to do when we share some control within limits and boundaries. So again, giving lots of limited choices all throughout the morning can help us walk through all those things that need to get done, even when our child isn't happy about the fact that they need to go to school today.
Great, that's super helpful. Thank you. Our next question is tips on what to do if downtime always equals screen time in the kid's mind. I struggle with getting my 13-year-old daughter to do anything besides screens for relaxing.
Yes, very challenging. And that's why I think having that clear shared agreement and a device use contract makes sense. So yes, it's a very passive way of I guess entertaining themselves. And so it might be an opportunity to sit down and brainstorm some other ideas that we reserve screen time for after homework has happened later in the day, and we come up with some other things that your child enjoys. So it might be painting, it might be listening to music, it could be reading. So kind of gathering a handful of ideas of what kids can do during downtime. And then again, we can go back to offering some limited choices. Hey, sweetie, we're going to have 30 minutes of downtime right now. Do you want to listen to your music in your room, or do you want to come out and do some of your painting while I'm getting dinner ready? So we're setting a limit. The limit is like, we don't have to say it, but screens are not an option. And we can offer some control of things that they can do.
That's great. Awesome to provide different options there. And then I know you mentioned earlier a website or author for child anxiety. Can you repeat that for attendees one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. Her name is Karen Young. She's actually out of Australia. And her website is called Hey Sigmund, like Sigmund Freud, Hey Sigmund. And her specialty is childhood anxiety and just has amazing resources. One of her books that I highly recommend is called Hey Warrior. It's a child's book about the brain and the amygdala and how your brain is there to actually protect you. And sometimes you have an overprotective brain, and your brain's that warrior that's there. So it's a really great book. And I think it helps kids also just better understand what they're feeling and why they're feeling that way.
Yeah, it's really important. Thanks for sharing that resource.
Sure.
All right. Next question is how to help foster a positive relationship between my child and their teachers, and how can I as a parent set up a good communication practice with their teachers?
Yeah. Well, I think taking advantage of all of those opportunities where they invite parents into school can be helpful. So there'll be sometimes a visit day before school starts, a back to school night. Some schools offer opportunities to volunteer in the classroom. Our schedules don't always allow for that, but I think being mindful that there are opportunities to be involved, and the more we do that, the more we can partner with teachers. I think just, going up to teachers and introducing ourselves, our kids will see this and they'll feel more comfortable when they see that we're comfortable with their teacher as well. So just getting to know their teacher. Don't be shy. They love it when parents come and introduce themselves. Let them know that you're there to support them in your child's learning journey. And I think that will start to facilitate connections and a relationship with the teacher.
Super helpful. It's great advice. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Next one is, can you give advice on managing teen dynamics, how to balance time with friends and responsibilities, as well as how to help them through conflicts that arise between girlfriends because of boy?
I think we need about 2 hours for this topic.
Probably.
Yeah. So, starting young with responsibilities, and this routine chart is kind of self-responsibility is a good starting place. If you have a teen, it's worth, and the beginning of the year is a great time to kind of like do a reset and talk about what the expectations are, and that some of the things our kids do or have, like phones and iPads, those are all privileges. So certain things need to happen in order for them to have those privileges. So getting really clear and specific about what those are ahead of time. And again, sitting down and writing this up, having an agreement, putting it up somewhere so it's visual can be really helpful. You're there to help your child manage those challenges with girls and topics around boys. Again, emotion coaching is an amazing tool to help your child better understand their issue, identify their feelings, feel heard and understood, and then feel supported in problem solving. So Dr. John Gottman has created a framework to help parents become emotion coaching parents. I typically teach it in a 2-hour course, so I just gave you little bits. But that might be a great resource to look into. And he's written a book called Raising an Emotionally Intelligent Child, where you can find that information.
Yeah, that's great. Definitely a challenging topic. So definitely something to check out.
Yes.
All right. We are now a 2-household blended family. Do you have any tips on how to maintain routine and consistency?
Yeah, so this is tricky, right? Because you may have had very different routines. And so I think the starting place is with you and your partner having an agreement as to whether or not you are going to collaborate and have shared expectations for all the children, or if each of you are going to manage your own children's routine. So it really starts with the parents first and getting clear on what they're comfortable with before moving forward and creating those clear agreements with kids. So if it is, we're going to have a combined household and our expectations are the same, bring everybody together, have those conversations. It's helpful to do it when things are positive, maybe having dessert after dinner where everybody feels relaxed and it's a positive environment, and just talk about the expectations for everybody in the family that applies to everybody. And again, the more that kids are involved in the conversation, the more that they're brainstorming the ideas, the more buy-in they're going to have to doing some of these things.
Yeah.
Again, that's another transition, right? On top of going back to school. So
yeah, definitely good advice though around setting expectations early on, the very beginning. That's great. Okay, last question. What are some ways to promote independence this school year? Homework is usually a battle, and I'd like my middle school age child to be more self-sufficient.
Yeah, so I don't know what your involvement is in the homework process, but I would say that make sure that they've given it their best try, confirm that they've spoken to their teacher. Sometimes, and this, feels counterintuitive, sometimes the opportunity is to step back and let them handle it on their own and fail. And that failure is an amazing opportunity for learning about what doesn't work. So when your child goes to school and they don't turn in homework, or they're swapping papers to correct, they're going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. And that discomfort, and I know we don't like our children feeling discomfort, is going to be a very good reinforcement of why it's important to get that homework done. Now, If the issue is that you're involved and there's that power struggle there, again, using lots of limited choices. Do you want to start off by yourself for the first 15 minutes, or do you want me to stay for 10 minutes and help guide you and then leave you on your own, kind of thing? So we can give them choices. Sometimes we need to remove ourselves and have somebody else step in if there's tutoring that's necessary. And lots of schools offer free tutoring, or it may require you encouraging your child to go in and talk to their teacher if they're struggling with the actual homework assignment. So probably need a little bit more detail on that, but I think being mindful of using limited choices to encourage them. Again, stepping back and letting them manage it on their own. Now is a great time to fail in life. There's really no harm to be done, and kids learn quickly from their mistakes because mistakes are simply opportunities for learning. And then if your child needs support and you need to remove yourself from that dynamic, reach out to the school and see what type of resources they have available to you.
Definitely. Great advice. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Well, we are at time. So thank you so much, Melissa, for your time today and for all the knowledge that you shared with us. That's all we have for today. If you have any more questions, we encourage you to enroll Maven, where